Hello, my name is Sammy Davidson, and for my disability research project, I'll be covering obsessive-compulsive disorder. So to begin, OCD is now known to be a neurological disorder related to Tourette's syndrome. However, in the past, before OCD was studied from a biological standpoint, it was largely believed to be a product of bad parenting and even some more fringe theories such as constipation or possession. While there is no OCD gene, research has found that those with immediate family members with OCD are more likely to have it themselves. In the US, the disorder affects approximately 1.2% of the population, or nearly 4 million people, and has a similar prevalence internationally of around 1.5% of the global population. OCD is characterized by a cyclical pattern of uncontrollable, recurring thoughts, also known as obsessions, that induce repetitive behaviors, compulsions. The image to the right here shows what is meant by this, as obsessive thoughts cause intense anxiety, and the person attempts to relieve this by performing a compulsion, but that relief is only temporary. And while there are no recognized subtypes of OCD, the DSM-5 does recognize 5 symptom groups, which we'll cover on the next slide. So as mentioned, the DSM-5 recognizes 5 symptom groups of OCD. These include cleaning, symmetry, taboo thoughts, hoarding, and fear of harm. For example, someone whose symptoms are most consistent with the cleaning or contamination symptom group likely has an overwhelming anxiety about germs and sickness, have continual thoughts of feeling either physically or mentally unclean, and will avoid anything they view as a source of contamination. They'll likely have compulsions to get rid of or clean items they view as contaminated and have cleaning rituals that they engage in daily. For another example, the taboo thoughts symptom group tends to involve a feeling of overwhelming guilt and anxiety about one's own thoughts, as well as frequent intrusive thoughts of often sexual or violent nature, coupled with persistent anxiety that one will act on these intrusive thoughts and guilt that having these thoughts makes them a bad person. This category also includes a specific type of OCD called scrupulosity, which we'll cover later in the discussion of my first person narrative. To wrap up the overview, some of the common comorbidities of OCD include depressive disorders, which affect about 63% of people, anxiety disorders, which affect about 76% of people, eating disorders and body dysmorphia, tic disorders, which affect about 30% of people, and as well as high functioning autism spectrum disorder. So while there's no specific IDEA category for OCD, students who receive special education services for OCD under IDEA are most often served under the EBD and OHI categories. And the definitions for those categories are provided here. And only 0.7% of students who receive special education services have a primary diagnosis of OCD. And within this 0.7%, 74.5% of those students receive services under IDEA, while the remainder receive services through 504 plans. And of the students served by IDEA, 51.4% are classified under the emotional disturbance category, and 31.8% are classified under the other health impairment category. And since there is no IDEA definition, the NIH definition is certainly much more helpful. The National Institute of Mental Health defines OCD as a long-lasting disorder in which a person experiences uncontrollable and recurring thoughts, obsessions, engages in repetitive behaviors, compulsions, or both. So the DSM-5 recognizes 4 diagnostic criteria for OCD, in addition to 2 specifications that must be made in the diagnosis. So the first diagnostic criteria, shown here with the key points highlighted, is the presence of either obsessions, compulsions, or both. Obsessions are defined as recurrent and persistent thoughts, urges, or impulses that are intrusive and unwanted and cause marked anxiety or distress. And then it's also stipulated that the person attempts to suppress these thoughts with an action. And then compulsions are defined as repetitive behaviors performed in response to an obsession, with the point being that the behavior is aimed at preventing or reducing anxiety or distress. However, the obsession and the related compulsion are not actually connected in any realistic way. Then the second diagnostic criteria is that the obsessions and or compulsions are both time-consuming or cause clinically significant impairment in important areas of functioning, and time-consuming is defined as taking up more than 1 hour per day. And then the third diagnostic criteria is that the symptoms cannot be attributed to the effects of some substance or medicine the individual might be taking or by another medical condition. And then the final diagnostic criteria kind of expands on the third one, and it just explains that the disturbance cannot be better accounted for by the symptoms of another mental disorder. And then this criterion then gives a number of examples of what this may look like, such as a ritualized eating behavior in the case of an eating disorder, or guilty ruminations in the case of a major depressive disorder. If those symptoms can better be explained by another disorder, that person will not be diagnosed with OCD. And then finally, in diagnosing OCD, 2 specifications must be made. So the first category of specifications deals with the person's own understanding of their obsessive-compulsive beliefs. So good or fair insight refers to a case in which a person recognizes that their beliefs are definitely not, probably not, or maybe not true. Poor insight refers to a case in which the person thinks their beliefs are probably true. And then lastly, absent insight or delusional beliefs refers to a case in which the individual is completely convinced their obsessive-compulsive beliefs are true. And then the second specification that must be made is if the individual has a current or past history of a tic disorder. So for example, an official OCD diagnosis would read something like obsessive-compulsive disorder with poor insight, not tic related, because those 2 specifications have to be made. And then continuing on to the development and course of OCD, the average age of onset in the United States is 19.5 years old. However, about 25% of all cases onset by the age of 14. And interestingly, even though OCD is slightly more common in females, the age of onset is generally earlier for males, with about 25% of cases being presenting by age 10. And then continuing onset after the age of 35 is incredibly uncommon, but is possible. And though the condition is chronic, it tends to come in waves, as the individual will likely have obsessive periods that can last anywhere from a few days to a few years, followed by calmer periods of remission. Normally, a highly triggering event will launch an obsessive period, and it's also important to note that the behavior patterns tend to have much more variation in children and become more stable as the person matures. And while the exact cause of OCD still remains unknown, the imaging studies have suggested the involvement of the prefrontal cortex, which is highlighted in purple and blue here, and is the area of the brain that is responsible for motor control, executive functions, emotional behaviors. Oh, I'm sorry, I read the wrong part. Which is the area of the brain that regulates thoughts and actions, sorry. And then the other part of the brain that is thought to be involved is the basal ganglia, which is highlighted in green here, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for motor control, executive functions, emotional behaviors, reward and reinforcement, addictive behaviors, and habit formation. And then also there's suggested involvement of the thalamus, which is highlighted in red on this image, which is the area of the brain that processes sensory and motor information, plays a role in sleep, consciousness, and learning. And then in addition to these 3 areas of the brain, 3 categories of risk factors have been defined. So temperamental risk factors indicate that those with greater internalizing and inhibiting behaviors in early childhood are more likely to develop OCD. And then there's environmental risk factors, which indicate that those who experience abuse in childhood, as well as other stressful or traumatic events, are more likely to have OCD. And then lastly, there's a physiological risk factor, which indicates that those with first-degree relatives with the disorder are up to 10 times more likely to have it themselves. And then in terms of cognitive development, most childhood cases are diagnosed between the ages of 7 and 12. And this chart to the right here provides a little more context for the average age of onset in OCD cases, and you can see that big spike around the late teens, early 20s. And then children and adolescents with the disorder may exhibit common age-appropriate obsessions or uncommon, not age-appropriate obsessions. It's really a very case-by-case thing. And whether the content of the obsessions is age-appropriate or not, the key distinguishing factor from anxiety disorders that may also be present in children is that the worries are frequent, highly irrational, and most importantly, that they induce compulsions. And then as people with the disorder mature, their beliefs and rituals will almost always become more structured. And there's also been an observed age difference in the content of compulsion. So, for example, adolescents tend to have higher rates of sexual and religious obsessions than children. And then children and adolescents tend to have higher rates of harm obsessions, for example, like fear of something happening to a loved one, than adults. And then in terms of physical development, there is no consistent impact of OCD on physical development, as it is what's referred to as an invisible disability. However, people may have compulsions that produce physical signs. So like trichotillomania, meaning the compulsion to pull hair, can cause someone to have severe bald spots, and seen in this image on the top left. Then if somebody has excoriation, which is the compulsion to pick skin, it can cause them to develop sores or scabs throughout their body where they tend to pick, as seen in the image on the top right. Someone with a hand washing compulsion will likely develop chapped and dry skin on their hands, as seen in the bottom left here. And then individuals may also develop other health conditions from compulsions that can have physical signs. So, for example, the author of my first person narrative, Jennifer Craig, she developed keratinosis, as seen on the bottom right here, which causes the skin to develop an orange undertone, as her diet-related compulsions led her to eat nearly nothing but cantaloupe and carrots for about 6 months. And then in terms of social development, OCD can definitely have some very dire effects. Both the avoidance of triggers and the following of obsessions and compulsions can lead to poor relationships, a lack of socialization, especially for young children, struggles to live independently, especially for young adults, familial dysfunction if, say, for example, a person's fear of contamination causes them to avoid their own family members or not allow guests to come to the home, a general distrust of others, severe interference with the development of life skills such as driving, an avoidance of both platonic and romantic relationships, a failure to complete school or job related work on time is a struggle for a lot who have more perfectionist compulsions, which can, greatly impact school performance and the ability to hold a job. And then in terms of emotional development, OCD also has some pretty serious impacts. So like on a neurological level, people with OCD tend to have irregularities in their brain's emotional processing system that causes things like anxiety, fear, disgust, and other emotions to induce irrational compulsions rather than typical healthy responses. People are also more likely to be embarrassed of their compulsions and beliefs, causing low self-esteem and that kind of feeling of being crazy that can cause people to isolate themselves socially to avoid embarrassment or bullying. And then in addition, people with OCD do have an increased risk of both suicidal ideation and suicide attempts, with as many as 50% of individuals with OCD reporting suicidal thoughts and up to 25% reporting suicide attempts. Depressive disorders being such a common comorbidity does further increase this risk. And people with OCD are also in a near perpetual state of high anxiety, and mood swings are common as well as a result of the disorder's cyclical nature. And then lastly, in terms of the development of communication skills, it's very common for people with OCD to struggle to articulate their thoughts, their fears, their emotions, often because of a fear of how others will perceive them, which can create a lot of emotional distance in both romantic and platonic relationships. Some people may develop a fear of speaking, both public and private, as well as a fear of confrontation for, similar reasons of a struggle to articulate and, a fear of how others perceive them. And then people with OCD also have higher reported cases of selective mutism, especially in early childhood, which greatly hinders the development of language skills. And then continuing on to strengths and challenges, it's first very important to note that these strengths are often something that people with the disorder are only able to harness through intense treatment, as kind of represented by this graphic in the top right corner here. And then like this struggle to turn strengths into challenges is central to the treatment of OCD. But that being said, the strengths that can be found include highly developed organizational skills, increased attention to detail, creativity because of such a highly active brain, determination kind of as a result of like the commitment to repetition, as well as empathy because, facing such a struggle daily often causes those with OCD to, just be naturally more empathetic to the struggles of others. And then although all of these have kind of been alluded to or stated in previous slides, to sum it up, the main challenges of OCD include what is often very severe social and occupational impairment as a result of compulsions, loss of time to compulsions, difficulties or avoidance of relationships, issues with response to treatment, depending on if they have fair insight, poor insight, delusional insight, as well as incredible difficulty focusing attention, again, because the brain is just so active. And then before I delve into some ideas for instructional strategies and classroom arrangement for students with OCD, I feel it's very important to note that, as is the case with all disabilities, every case of OCD is unique, and kind of as a result of that, every student has unique needs, and there's no solution that's like a one-size-fits-all. So then, everything that follows is a generalization, and specific cases, of course, have to be considered when making choices for individual students. So that being said, the first recommendation I would make is to give students an advance notice of any routine changes that may be happening in the classroom. This is important because schedule changes can be highly disruptive and potentially triggering for students with OCD, because since there's already so much happening in their brains, especially in a stressful environment like school, unexpected changes to the student's routine can create high levels of anxiety. So just giving them that ability to prepare for the change is really important to reduce the frustration and stress that comes with changes to routine. And obviously things happen and this cannot be done all the time, but it should be done as much as possible. And then continuing, the second recommendation I would make is to break assignments down into more manageable steps or chunks. And giving this increased structure to the assignments kind of allows the student to focus their attention in and have less anxiety than they would looking at a giant multi-page handout for a large assignment. And then even for smaller assignments, the students can certainly benefit from, say a math homework has 5 questions, only having one question shown on each page or being given some sort of guiding structure can just really help to reduce that anxiety and focus attention. And then lastly, the third recommendation I would make is to provide audiobooks for students with OCD. I say this because students with OCD often struggle to read and comprehend in a timely manner because of all that's going on in their minds. So this kind of struggle to read and comprehend tends to only create more anxiety as students worry about missing material and falling behind in class. But by providing audiobooks, the student has a secondhand source to confirm what they're reading so they don't find themselves circling back over the same few pages to make sure they read it correctly, as students with OCD tend to have a need for constant reassurance of their understanding. And then in terms of classroom arrangement, just like all other accommodations, they need to be based on student preferences. So for example, a student with more visible compulsions like tapping or scratching, they might prefer to sit towards the back of the classroom so they don't feel like their peers are watching them. Or for example, a student who's easily distracted by noise and the actions of others may need the opposite. They may need to be seated away from the hallway and in the front of the room where they're less distracted by their peers. Teachers should also, of course, make a very concerted effort to avoid preventable triggers in the classroom by doing something like allowing a student access to cleaning wipes or hand sanitizers if they so desire, and giving the student a heads up if a topic that could be triggering will be discussed so they have an opportunity to, excuse themselves if they feel a need to. Teachers should also manage the fatigue of their students by scheduling more demanding activities towards the beginning of the day, as fatigue can play a really big role in a student's levels of anxiety and compulsivity, especially as they get more fatigued throughout the day. And then lastly, if it's possible, the teacher should make an effort to have a calm corner, kind of seen on the image here, or some sort of other space, either in the classroom or outside of the classroom, where like in the event of a panic attack or severe compulsions or just the need to excuse themselves for a second, the student has a space in the classroom or in the school where they could go to calm down, collect themselves, and refocus on the classroom activity. And these kinds of spaces should also be made available to all students, in order to reduce any stigma that might be associated with using them. And then in terms of assistive technologies, there's not a whole lot specifically for OCD, but recording devices and stress management apps can definitely be very useful. So since students with OCD are likely, preoccupied with their obsessions, kind of what we talked about when I recommended audiobooks, they might have trouble following along in class. So being able to use a recording device like the one shown in the image here will allow the student to be able to access class information at a later time and be able to, take more accurate notes. It also allows the student to study information, again, with kind of that secondhand source, so there's less pressure, they have more control, and they don't have the anxiety of like a fast-moving lecture. And then students could also benefit from the use of stress management apps. For the example, there's one called Breathe to Relax, as well as Headspace, which both provide guided meditation sessions and other anxiety reducing tactics available to the users at any time. And then this last one in the bottom with the blue logo here, GG-OCD, is an app specifically tailored to OCD that aims to increase the user's awareness of their negative and obsessive thoughts and kind of train the brain to challenge their thoughts and compulsions. And then on this slide, there's just 6 resources, 3 for parents and 3 for teachers related to OCD specifically in children. So the first link for parents leads to an explanation of one of the most effective OCD treatments, exposure and response therapy, which works to teach people with the disorder to manage their reactions to triggers. And then the second link is a guide to managing OCD in the home, as it can really have severe effects on a family function and structure. And then the last link is a database that can locate nearby therapists and support groups specializing in OCD. And then on the teacher side, the first link is to the Child Mind Institute's Teacher's Guide to OCD, which gives an overview of what OCD may look like in the classroom and makes suggestions for ways to support students. And then those other two links also point to suggestions for instructional strategies and accommodations to support students with OCD. And then in her TED Talk, Tasha Johnson, the mother of a daughter with OCD, tells a story of how her daughter's OCD impacts her daily life and relationships. So after this clip of the video, Johansson goes on to describe how she reacts when her daughter has episodes such as the one she describes, a strategy she calls starving the monster, in which she encourages her daughter's irrational behaviors, which interestingly discourages her from performing them. And then continuing on to my first person narrative. So the first person narrative I read earlier in the course was Devil in the Details, Scenes from an Obsessive Girlhood by Jennifer Traig. And in her memoir, Traig tells a series of stories from her childhood in the 1970s and 1980s in rural Northern California as she battled an intense case of OCD. Traig's case was a combination of scrupulosity towards Judaism, meaning an obsessive and incredibly disciplined observance of the religion, contamination fears of both germs and morals, and an eating disorder. Traig's contamination and diet-related compulsions did come from her scrupulous observance of kosher laws. And despite having fair insight, Traig's case was incredibly severe and caused a great deal of dysfunction in her family life. But however, after receiving therapy in her late teens, she was eventually able to achieve sustained remission and now describes herself as stable, though she is still an intense hypochondriac. So in chapter 12 of her memoir titled Hell on Wheels, Traig describes her reluctance to begin driving and her struggles with driving after her parents forced her to get her license just before she turned 18. And in the following passage, she tells a story remarkably similar to that told by Tasha Johansson in her TED Talk, where she writes that the main problem, of course, was not in my body, but in my brain. OCD is based upon an irrational belief that if you don't do something perfectly, someone will get hurt. but with driving, that's a distinct possibility. Obsessive compulsives vary in their habits, but we all do the exact same thing when we get in the car. We circle endlessly, convinced that we ran someone over without noticing and then heading back to check. I could circle the block forever in circuits that both mimicked and reinforced my neural loops. I was literally driving myself crazy. So I feel like this passage and Johansson's story just kind of show how detrimental OCD can be to someone's learning and function, doing something that most people will barely ever even think twice about. And then the last few slides are just all of my references. And thank you for watching.